73 years ago, in the dense jungles of northern Burma, a Japanese scout named Corporal Takeshi Yamada vanished during a chaotic retreat from Allied forces. What his unit believed to be a fatal ambush became something far more disturbing, a calculated disappearance into enemy territory where Yamada would spend 6 weeks operating alone, hunting soldiers with methodical precision. The war had taught him to survive, but the jungle transformed him into something the Imperial Army had never intended to create. When Yamada's squad was overrun near the Irrawaddy River in March 1944, 17 men died in the opening minutes. The survivors scattered into the forest, following standard protocol to regroup at a predetermined rally point 15 kilometers south. Yamada never arrived. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Hideaki Sato, documented the loss in his field report with stark brevity. Corporal Yamada, presumed killed in action. Body not recovered. The military machine processed his death with administrative efficiency. His family in Hokkaido received notification within 3 months. His personal effects were catalogued and his name was added to the regiment's casualty list. But Yamada had not died in that ambush. He had made a choice that would haunt Allied intelligence reports for decades. In the confusion of the attack, Yamada had separated from his unit deliberately, moving perpendicular to the retreat route while his comrades fled south. He carried only his Arisaka rifle, 43 rounds of ammunition, a bayonet, 2 canteens, and a canvas bag containing rice balls that would last 3 days. His reasoning, later reconstructed from fragmentary accounts, was tactical rather than emotional. The rally point would be obvious to enemy scouts. The southern route would be monitored. Survival, he calculated, required isolation and absolute self-reliance. What Yamada possessed that most soldiers lacked was experience. Before conscription, he had spent 12 years as a professional hunter in the mountains of northern Japan, tracking deer and wild boar through terrain that taught patience and observation. The jungle was different, humid, dense, alive with threats his homeland never presented, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. To survive, he needed to become invisible. To remain invisible, he needed to think like prey, while acting like a predator. The first week tested every skill he had accumulated. Yamada moved only at dawn and dusk, sleeping in elevated positions within the dense canopy where snakes and insects were manageable threats compared to human patrols. He avoided trails entirely, navigating by reading the behavior of birds and the direction of water flow. His rice lasted 4 days through careful rationing. After that, he subsisted on roots, insects, and occasionally small animals he could kill silently with his bayonet. The jungle's abundance was deceptive. Many plants were toxic. Many sounds indicated danger rather than opportunity. By the 9th day, Yamada had established a territory. He had identified 3 water sources, 4 defensible sleeping positions, and 2 game trails used by wild pigs. More importantly, he had begun to notice patterns in Allied patrol movements. British and Indian units followed predictable schedules, moving through the same corridors at similar times, their discipline making them trackable. This observation shifted something fundamental in Yamada's thinking. He was no longer simply hiding, he was studying. The transformation from survivor to hunter occurred gradually, without conscious decision. Yamada began following patrol routes at a distance, memorizing timings and formations. He noted which soldiers carried radios, which appeared fatigued, which moved with less caution as days passed. He learned to distinguish units by their equipment sounds, the particular rhythm of British boots versus Indian issue, the metallic signatures of different rifle types. This intelligence had no strategic value. Yamada had no means to communicate with Japanese forces, no way to leverage what he learned. But the act of observation gave structure to his isolation, transforming aimless survival into purposeful existence. On the 14th day, Yamada made his first direct observation of an enemy soldier at close range. A British private, separated from his patrol to relieve himself, stood less than 8 meters away, completely unaware of the figure crouched in the undergrowth. Yamada could have killed him easily, a single rifle shot, or even silent approach with the bayonet. Instead, he watched, studying the man's movements, his weapon handling, the way he scanned the jungle before returning to his unit. The encounter lasted 3 minutes. Yamada remained motionless for 20 minutes after the soldier departed, his heart rate steady, his breathing controlled. He did not fire because firing would reveal his position, waste ammunition, and provide no tactical advantage. But he also did not fire because the act of observation had become more valuable than the act of killing. In that moment, Yamada crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer a soldier cut off from his unit. He had become something the military manuals never described, a solitary operative accountable to no command structure, bound by no orders, operating within a moral framework he alone would define. The jungle had accepted him. Now he would make it his weapon. By the 3rd week, Corporal Yamada had constructed an invisible infrastructure within 5 square kilometers of jungle. He maintained 4 camouflage sleeping positions, rotated on a 3-day cycle, preventing pattern establishment that could be tracked. Each site was elevated, positioned near water, and featured multiple escape routes. He never slept more than 4 hours consecutively, waking to absolute stillness, listening to the jungle's nocturnal language for signs of human intrusion. The rain was constant, transforming the terrain into a maze of mud and standing water, but Yamada had learned to move through it without leaving readable tracks. His diet had stabilized through systematic foraging. He consumed tree bark with medicinal properties to prevent dysentery, supplemented protein intake with insects and occasional monitor lizards, and maintained iron levels through wild leafy plants identified by their distinct vein patterns. Hunger was persistent but manageable. He had reduced his body's caloric needs through minimal movement during daylight hours, conserving energy for the hours when observation was productive. His uniform had deteriorated rapidly in the humidity, the fabric rotting against his skin, but he preserved critical components, boots, rifle sling, ammunition pouches, with obsessive care. The Arisaka rifle had become an extension of his consciousness. Yamada cleaned it daily using improvised materials, strips of his undershirt for cloth, rendered animal fat for lubrication, ashes mixed with water for corrosive removal. He had test-fired it only once in 21 days, confirming 0 at dawn when ambient noise from the jungle would mask the report. 41 rounds remained. Each represented a decision he had not yet made. Allied patrol activity had increased significantly in the area, suggesting the region held strategic importance Yamada could not determine from his isolated position. He had identified 3 distinct British units, 2 Indian battalions, and occasional American liaison officers, distinguishable by their different gear configurations. The patterns were consistent. Morning patrols swept westward along established routes, afternoon movements focused on river approaches, and night operations were minimal. This predictability was both advantage and trap. It allowed Yamada to avoid contact, but it also indicated Allied confidence in their territorial control. Now te convido a deixar nos comentários de onde você está nos assistindo e o horário exato em que escuta esta história. Nos interessa saber até quais lugares e em quais momentos do dia ou da noite chegam estes relatos documentados. On the 23rd day, Yamada observed something that altered his operational calculus. A 4-man British patrol established a temporary observation post 800 meters from one of his sleeping positions, constructing a concealed platform overlooking a river crossing. They rotated presence in 6-hour shifts, maintaining discipline but exhibiting increasing complacency as days passed without contact. Yamada watched from concealment, noting their routines, their equipment, the exact timing of shift changes. He could have relocated to avoid proximity, but instead he chose to study the vulnerability. The observation post represented a tactical problem. Its position threatened Yamada's freedom of movement, limiting access to his primary water source and forcing longer, more exposed routes between his established positions. The professional hunter's instinct suggested the logical solution: elimination. Remove the threat, restore operational mobility, but the soldier's training imposed caution. Engaging enemy forces would trigger searches, bring reinforcements, potentially collapse his entire survival infrastructure. For 6 days, Yamada monitored the post without action. He learned the names of 2 soldiers from overheard conversations. He identified which man smoked, which complained about rations, which maintained sharper vigilance during his watch rotation. This knowledge created an unexpected psychological burden. The enemy soldiers had transformed from abstract threats into individuals with identifiable characteristics, habits, vulnerabilities. Their humanity became visible in a way that mass combat never permitted. On the morning of the 29th day, the observation post was quietly abandoned. The British unit withdrew, leaving behind spent cigarette tins and minor equipment damage to the platform. Yamada approached hours after their departure, examining the site with forensic attention. They had been watching for Japanese troop movements that never materialized, eventually concluding the area was tactically insignificant. Their withdrawal vindicated Yamada's decision not to engage. Violence would have proven their assumptions wrong, brought overwhelming response. But something had shifted in Yamada's psychology during those 6 days of intimate observation. He had experienced the predator's ultimate paradox, the proximity to prey that could not be taken without unacceptable cost. The restraint required had been more difficult than any physical hardship the jungle imposed. He recognized that his isolation was not simply geographic, it was moral. Every decision he made existed in a space outside military law, beyond the communal accountability of unit cohesion. He was accountable only to his own survival calculus, and that freedom was becoming its own form of imprisonment. The jungle at night produced sounds Yamada had learned to categorize with precision: the rustle of palm rats, the territorial calls of gibbons, the approach of rain moving through the canopy. But increasingly, he noticed another sound: his own breathing, his own heartbeat, the biological evidence of existence that seemed, in the consuming silence, almost unbearably loud. In the 5th week, Corporal Yamada encountered a problem that pure survival skills could not solve. Allied activity in the region had intensified to the point where his established routes were no longer viable. New patrol patterns intersected his water sources, and helicopter reconnaissance, a technology Yamada had only heard described, never witnessed, began systematic sweeps of the jungle canopy. The invisible infrastructure he had built was collapsing under the pressure of enemy operational expansion. On the 33rd day, Yamada made the decision that would define everything that followed. He would not relocate. He would engage. The choice was not driven by military objective or ideological commitment. Yamada had been isolated long enough to recognize that the larger war had become abstraction. He could not influence outcomes, could not contribute intelligence, could not rejoin Japanese forces whose positions he did not know. His survival had become entirely self-referential. He continued because continuation was possible, but the Allied presence was making continuation impossible. The logic was mechanical. To preserve his territory, he needed to create fear sufficient to redirect enemy movement patterns. Yamada selected his target with the methodical care of his hunting background. A 2-man British patrol conducted daily reconnaissance along a narrow ridge trail, passing within 400 meters of his primary sleeping position each afternoon between 1400 and 1500 hours. Their route was predictable, their spacing consistent, their vigilance diminished by repetition. The terrain offered a natural ambush position, elevated ground with clear sight lines, dense cover for approach and withdrawal, and multiple escape routes into areas too steep for rapid pursuit. For 3 days, Yamada prepared. He cleared firing lanes with minimal disturbance, identifying exact distances using improvised range estimation. He pre-positioned water and minimal rations along his planned withdrawal route. He test-loaded his rifle at night, practicing the mechanical sequence until muscle memory eliminated conscious thought. He calculated wind patterns at the expected engagement time, noting how afternoon thermals created predictable air movement along the ridge. The psychological preparation was more complex. Yamada had killed during the war, in combat at distance, within the moral framework of military necessity. This would be different. This would be deliberate, intimate, and isolated from the communal absolution of unit action. There would be no officer to give orders, no comrades to share culpability. The decision would be entirely his, and the consequences would exist in a space beyond military law or cultural tradition. On the 37th day, the patrol arrived 17 minutes early. Yamada, already in position for 90 minutes, adjusted his breathing and settled the rifle against his shoulder. The two soldiers moved with casual efficiency, weapons held at low ready, conversation audible but words indistinct. The lead soldier was younger, less experienced in his movement patterns. The trailing soldier walked with the confident inefficiency of repeated routine. Yamada's crosshairs settled on the lead soldier's center mass at 220 meters. The range was comfortable, the target clear, the wind negligible. His finger rested against the trigger with practiced pressure. 5 pounds of force separated observation from action. He did not fire. The soldiers passed through his kill zone and disappeared down the trail, unaware they had been seconds from death. Yamada remained motionless for 40 minutes, his rifle still raised, his breathing still controlled. The decision not to fire had not been conscious. His body had simply refused to complete the mechanical sequence. Something in the profound isolation had created a barrier his tactical reasoning could not overcome. That night, Yamada experienced his first significant psychological crisis since entering the jungle. He had compromised his operational plan, wasted 3 days of preparation, and failed to address the fundamental threat to his survival infrastructure. The failure was not physical. His skills remained intact. The failure was moral. In the absolute freedom of isolation, he had discovered a limitation he had not known existed. But the Allied patrol patterns did not change, and the pressure on his territory continued to increase. 2 days later, a different unit established a semi-permanent camp less than 1 kilometer from his northern sleeping position. The encroachment was systematic, deliberate, and ultimately unsustainable for Yamada's continued presence. On the 40th day, Yamada made a different decision. If he could not create fear through violence, he would create fear through presence. He began leaving signs. Equipment moved slightly from cache positions, debris arranged in patterns impossible to attribute to natural causes, tracks visible enough to suggest human movement, but ambiguous enough to create uncertainty. The strategy was psychological rather than tactical. He would make the jungle feel occupied, hostile, unpredictable. The effect was immediate and disproportionate. Within 3 days, patrol patterns shifted noticeably. Soldiers moved with increased caution, spent less time in vulnerable positions, reduced their operational tempo. Yamada had weaponized their imagination, turning the jungle itself into a source of threat that required no bullets, no contact, no verification. He had learned something the military manuals never taught. In isolation, the most effective violence is the violence that never occurs. The shot not taken creates more fear than the shot that finds its target, because uncertainty is more corrosive than confirmed threat. The jungle had made him a hunter, but conscience had made him something more dangerous, a ghost. By the 6th week, Corporal Yamada had been alone longer than any operational doctrine anticipated. The human mind, evolved for social connection, begins to fracture when isolated from communal context for extended periods. Yamada experienced this deterioration, not as dramatic collapse, but as subtle erosion. Thoughts that looped without resolution, memories that felt simultaneously distant and overwhelming, a growing uncertainty about which internal voices represented rational calculation versus psychological compensation. The signs he had been leaving for Allied forces had evolved from tactical misdirection into something more complex. Yamada found himself spending hours arranging jungle debris into geometric patterns, cleaning and recleaning his rifle beyond functional necessity, speaking aloud to himself in full sentences that addressed absent superiors and family members. These behaviors served no survival purpose, yet he could not stop. The structure they provided had become essential to maintaining coherent thought. Se essa história te surpreendeu, já deixa o like para ajudar o canal. On the 44th day, Yamada encountered another solitary figure. An Indian soldier, separated from his unit during a monsoon storm, stumbled into the clearing where Yamada had been foraging. The two men saw each other simultaneously at less than 20 meters, close enough that neither weapon could be raised with advantage, close enough that facial expressions were clearly visible. Neither man moved. The Indian soldier was younger, perhaps 19, his uniform soaked and his equipment in disarray. His rifle was slung across his back, inaccessible. Yamada's hand rested on his bayonet, but he did not draw it. For 15 seconds, they simply stared. Two isolated humans, recognizing mutual vulnerability in a space where doctrine had no answer. The Indian soldier broke the paralysis first. He raised both hands slowly, palms visible, then backed away carefully, maintaining eye contact until the jungle obscured him. Yamada heard him moving rapidly eastward, branches breaking as distance became priority over stealth. No shots were fired. No alarm was raised. The encounter existed in a space outside the war, a moment of shared recognition that combat training had not prepared either man to process. That night, Yamada could not sleep. The encounter had violated something fundamental in his psychological architecture. He had spent 6 weeks becoming invisible, building an identity around solitary competence and predatory patience. But the Indian soldier's eyes had reflected back something Yamada was trying to suppress: the fundamental loneliness of his situation, the arbitrary nature of survival, the possibility that courage and cowardice were indistinguishable when stripped of communal witness. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Yamada began experiencing vivid, intrusive memories of his life before conscription. His wife's voice, the smell of his daughter's hair, the specific texture of snow in January mornings. These memories had been carefully suppressed during the first weeks of isolation, but they now returned with overwhelming intensity. He would find himself motionless for hours, trapped in recollections so vivid it felt more real than his current physical circumstances. By the 48th day, Yamada made a decision that confirmed his deteriorating judgment. He decided to return to the abandoned Allied observation post he had monitored weeks earlier. There was no tactical justification. The position offered no survival advantage, contained no useful equipment, posed significant exposure risk. But Yamada needed to occupy a space that humans had recently inhabited, to touch materials that hands had touched, to stand where others had stood. He approached the post at dusk, moving with the exaggerated caution of someone aware their decision-making had become compromised. The platform was collapsing under tropical rot, already being reclaimed by the jungle's relentless growth. Yamada climbed onto the structure and sat where he had seen the British soldier sit during his observations. He found a cigarette tin, rusted, but still containing 2 intact cigarettes. He did not smoke, had never smoked, but he placed one between his lips and sat motionless as darkness consumed the forest. The absurdity of his situation crystallized in that moment. He was a Japanese corporal, officially dead, sitting on an abandoned enemy position, holding a British cigarette, completely disconnected from the war whose uniform he still wore. He had survived 6 weeks through skill and discipline, but survival itself had become the only remaining objective. There was no extraction plan, no intelligence to gather, no unit to rejoin. He was simply continuing because stopping required a decision he had not yet made. That night, sleeping on the observation platform, Yamada dreamed of his village in Hokkaido. In the dream, he was returning from a hunting expedition, carrying a deer he had tracked for 3 days. His family waited at the edge of the forest, but when he called out, they did not respond. He walked closer and realized they could not see him. He had become transparent, a ghost passing through a world that no longer registered his presence. He woke before dawn, disoriented and emotionally compromised. The realization that his isolation was self-imposed, that he could attempt to surrender, could try to reach Allied lines, could end the solitary existence. This realization did not provide relief. It created terror. Because Yamada understood that the jungle had given him something he would lose if he returned to human society, it had given him absolute agency, freedom from judgment, escape from the communal expectations that defined civilian and military life alike. In the pre-dawn darkness, sitting on a rotting enemy observation post, Yamada understood the truth. He was no longer surviving the jungle, he was hiding in it. On the morning of the 53rd day, Corporal Yamada heard a sound that did not belong to the jungle's organic vocabulary: radiostatic, fragmented Japanese voices cutting through atmospheric interference. He froze mid-step, his entire body oriented toward the impossible transmission. For 6 weeks, he had been linguistically isolated, his internal monologue the only Japanese he heard. The sudden presence of his native language created a physical reaction. His hands trembled, his vision blurred, his throat constricted with an emotion he could not immediately name. The transmission was coming from the southwest, perhaps 2 kilometers distant. Yamada moved toward it with mechanical precision, abandoning caution he had maintained for weeks. Each step brought the voices into clearer resolution. A forward observation unit, reporting coordinates, requesting artillery support for a position Yamada's mental map suggested was near the Chindwin River. Japanese forces were active in the region. He was not the last soldier. He was not irretrievably isolated. It took Yamada 4 hours to reach visual range of the unit. A platoon-strength force, approximately 30 soldiers, had established a fortified position on elevated ground overlooking a river approach. Their defensive works showed professional construction, interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged positions, communication trenches connecting weapon emplacements. This was not a desperate remnant. This was an operational military unit conducting legitimate defensive operations. Yamada observed from concealment for 3 hours, studying the unit's composition and morale. The soldiers moved with disciplined efficiency. Their equipment was well maintained. Their command structure was clearly functional. He recognized the unit insignia, 28th Infantry Regiment, a formation that had been operating in Burma since early 1943. These were veteran soldiers conducting complex operations. They could provide exfiltration, medical evaluation, reintegration into command structure. But Yamada did not approach. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he remained in concealment, watching soldiers who represented everything he had been trained to value: duty, cohesion, collective purpose. The path forward was obvious: reveal himself, provide situation report, resume role within military hierarchy. The isolation would end. The psychological burden of solitary decision-making would dissolve back into the communal structure of orders and obedience. Instead, Yamada withdrew. He moved carefully back into the jungle, retracing his approach route, returning to the territory he had claimed through 6 weeks of silent occupation. The decision was not conscious or rational. It was instinctive, emerging from a part of his psyche that had transformed during the isolation. That night, for the first time since entering the jungle, Yamada did not sleep. He sat motionless in his primary sleeping position, his rifle across his knees, his mind processing the encounter with methodical precision. He had discovered that he did not want to be found. The revelation was disturbing not in its content, but in its certainty. 6 weeks of isolation had not been imprisonment. It had been liberation from expectations he had never consciously acknowledged. In military service, every action occurred within a framework of judgment. Superiors evaluated performance, peers measured courage, subordinates observed leadership. Even in civilian life, his identity had been defined relationally: husband, father, hunter, community member. But in the jungle, stripped of all social context, Yamada had experienced a freedom so profound it had become indistinguishable from madness. He answered to no one. His successes and failures existed without witness. His moral calculations required no external validation. The Japanese unit remained in position for 6 days. Yamada monitored them continuously, studying their operations with the same attention he had given Allied patrols. He noted their supply situation, their defensive preparations, their patrol patterns. He could have provided tactical intelligence that would enhance their position. He could have warned them about Allied helicopter reconnaissance he had observed. He could have contributed meaningfully to their operational effectiveness. He did nothing. On the 59th day, the unit received orders and withdrew. Yamada watched them depart in tactical formation, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The radio traffic indicated they were repositioning to support a larger offensive operation 40 kilometers north. Within 6 hours, the position was abandoned, the fortifications empty, the radio silence complete. Yamada approached the abandoned position that evening. The soldiers had left minor equipment, damaged entrenching tools, empty ammunition crates, personal items too worn to carry. He found a photograph half buried in mud, showing 3 soldiers smiling at the camera, their faces young and optimistic. The image had been trampled, probably accidentally, during the withdrawal. Yamada cleaned it carefully and placed it on a rock where rain would not damage it further. He did not take it with him. The photograph belonged to the communal world of military service, to soldiers who existed within networks of accountability and shared purpose. Yamada recognized he no longer belonged to that world. The jungle had claimed him more completely than any military oath. As he returned to his territory, moving through familiar routes with unconscious precision, Yamada understood the final transformation. He was no longer a soldier surviving in isolation. He was an isolated man who happened to still wear a uniform. The distinction was absolute and irreversible. Corporal Takeshi Yamada remained in the Burmese jungle for 14 additional days after encountering the Japanese unit, bringing his total isolation to 73 days. The final 2 weeks were marked not by dramatic incident, but by quiet resolution. A man who had discovered something in solitude that made return to human society feel like a greater threat than any the jungle presented. On the 68th day, Yamada's isolation ended not through choice, but through circumstance. A British patrol, following intelligence about Japanese unit movements in the region, swept through his territory with overwhelming numerical strength. Yamada had options. He could have evaded, relocated, maintained his invisible existence. Instead, he stood and allowed himself to be captured. The British soldiers who found him later filed reports describing a Japanese corporal in deteriorated uniform, armed but offering no resistance, speaking no English but displaying no fear. Medical examination at a forward aid station revealed significant weight loss, parasitic infections, and minor jungle injuries, but nothing suggesting combat trauma or acute mental breakdown. Yamada answered questions through interpreters with mechanical precision: name, rank, unit, date of separation. He provided no tactical intelligence, revealed no information about the Japanese unit he had observed, and showed no interest in the war's larger strategic situation. His interrogators noted something unusual in their reports. Yamada exhibited none of the psychological markers typical of isolated soldiers: no desperate relief at rescue, no anxiety about his military status, no concern about how his prolonged absence would be interpreted. He was, they noted, unnaturally calm, as if captivity and freedom were equivalent states. Yamada spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner facility in India, where he was described by camp administrators as a model prisoner who spoke minimally, caused no disruption, and showed no interest in the social hierarchies that developed among captive soldiers. He did not participate in camp activities, did not form friendships, and spent most of his time in isolated areas of the compound when permitted. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Yamada was repatriated, along with thousands of other prisoners. The journey home took 3 months, during which fellow soldiers attempted to engage him in conversation about their wartime experiences. Yamada's responses were brief and factual. He did not share stories, did not seek connection, did not display the emotional complexity typical of men returning from years of combat and captivity. He returned to Hokkaido in November 1945. His wife had received notification of his death in 1944, remarried in early 1945, and was living in a different prefecture. His daughter, now 6 years old, had no memory of him. The village where he had worked as a hunter before the war had been partially depopulated by conscription and economic collapse. There was no position to return to, no community waiting for his reintegration. Military records show that Yamada filed no compensation claims, sought no recognition for his service, and made no attempt to contact his former unit or superior officers. He found work as a day laborer in a forestry operation, performing manual work that required minimal social interaction. Co-workers remembered him as competent but distant, someone who completed tasks with mechanical efficiency but never joined communal meals or evening conversations. In 1952, a journalist researching isolated Japanese soldiers during the war's final years located Yamada through military records and attempted an interview. Yamada declined. The journalist persisted, eventually finding him at the forestry camp. In the brief conversation that followed, Yamada made only one substantive statement about his 73 days alone in the Burmese jungle. "I learned that a man can carry the war inside him longer than the war lasts outside." The journalist asked for elaboration. Yamada returned to work without responding. He died in 1968 at age 52 of complications from chronic tropical diseases contracted during the war. He left no family, no significant possessions, and no written account of his experiences. The forestry company, where he worked for 16 years, noted his death in their administrative records with a single line: "Employee demonstrated reliability and minimal absence." The British military files regarding Yamada's capture were declassified in 1989. They contain interrogation transcripts, medical evaluations, and a brief psychological assessment. The camp psychiatrist who evaluated him in 1945 wrote a note that was never included in the official record. "Subject exhibits what I would characterize as functional detachment, not dissociation in the clinical sense, but a conscious withdrawal from social bonds that appears to cause him no distress. He survived isolation by becoming isolated. The jungle did not break him. It taught him that breaking was optional." The Burmese jungle where Yamada spent 73 days was cleared for agriculture in the 1970s. The ridge where he nearly killed 2 British soldiers is now part of a tea plantation. The observation post where he experienced his psychological crisis collapsed into the undergrowth decades ago. No marker indicates that a man once lived there alone. learning lessons about freedom and imprisonment that no military doctrine ever codified. The war created millions of casualties, men killed, wounded, captured, displaced. But it also created something the statistics never measured: men who survived intact but were fundamentally altered, carrying invisible injuries that never healed because they were never recognized as wounds. Yamada was not a hero. He was not a victim. He was a witness to something the war revealed about human capacity: that isolation can be chosen, that solitude can become preferable to connection, that a man can learn to live entirely inside his own consciousness and find that territory sufficient. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Corporal Takeshi Yamada. We'll see you in the next video.